Hello everyone, welcome to Zooming in China Chat. I'm Simone Gao. The Chinese Communist Party just had its sixth plenary session a couple weeks ago. From it, a third historic resolution was passed. It is largely believed that this resolution was produced to promote Xi Jinping to an equal footing with Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping, the CCP's two supreme leaders, to pave the way for Xi Jinping to take a third term as the top leader of the country next year. Next week, I will have a detailed analysis on this resolution to see how it impacts Xi Jinping, China, and the world. But before that, I would like to share with you my conversation with Dave Stilwell, former Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. We talked about the post-sixth plenary session cross-strait relations. Will there be a war over Taiwan? How will America respond? Take a listen. Secretary Stilwell, thank you so much for joining Zooming in today.
Glad to be here.
Okay, President Biden has repeatedly said the U.S. will protect Taiwan if China invades Taiwan. But each time, either the White House or Secretary of Defense will then came out and declare that the U.S.-China policy hasn't changed. U.S. one China policy hasn't changed. And that leaves people the impression that there is still strategic ambiguity on the Taiwan Strait. So is that the case? Still strategic ambiguity on Taiwan?
Well, I think the president is reflecting the just general sentiment about Americans' values in trying to protect a democratic and free market system against hostility and aggression. Like a lot of us, we all come to the Taiwan question, neophytes, babes in arms. And it takes a while to understand all the ins and outs of the Taiwan Relation Act, the Six Assurances, and all those things. And that's something a president has a hard time. I mean, any president has a hard time, taking on and memorizing. So I think what you're seeing is from the highest level of American leadership, a commitment to respond to aggression and to, defend those things that share values like a democratic and a free market system. And what you're doing here and what you've been doing, I think, in showing the contrast between what the mainland provides and what Taiwan stands for is enormously important. And so I would take the president's words, and here's a chance to maybe add some clarity here. Take the president's words as a general statement of sentiment by the U.S. On the Taiwan question, and then the walkbacks, I think, are more. Again, they do contribute to the ambiguity, which in my mind is helpful. Some people don't agree. But if you saw Secretary Blinken, he also made a fairly strong statement today about U.S. commitment to like-minded and commitment to peaceful resolution. I mean, that's the basis of all of this. The agreement with the PRC is this question of Taiwan would be resolved peacefully through dialogue without coercion or use of force. That we stand very strong on. Does that help? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I understand where you come from. But, people have been talking about different scenarios in the cross-strait relations. And one scenario they've been talking about is not just like a full invasion on Taiwan, but, for example, a takeover or invasion on the Paradise Island. If that happens, how do you think the U.S. will react?
Well, you make a very good point. And this is the problem with red lines, by the way. If you get away from a policy of ambiguity, you then put yourself into a corner. And if the PRC has proven itself time and again willing to use that tactic of, the South China Sea island building campaign and the 2015 commitment not to militarize the islands, while at the same time militarizing the islands, shows you, one, PRC does not keep its word, doesn't believe in contracts. It believes treaties and other things are scraps of paper. And two, it shows you that they would prefer this incremental approach that avoids any direct conflict that could lead to a much greater escalation. They're not very confident in how that might go. So a direct attack on Taiwan or any other area of significant American interest. I mean, look what they're doing on the border with India. Any attacks like this, I think, carry too much risk, where they believe in what we've seen historically is this just gradual, put a toe over a line, this gradualism, incrementalism. It's very difficult to make a decision. Which grain of sand that they put down on the South China Sea reefs, which grain of sand was going to be reason enough for the Americans to go to war? And the answer is, when you're very slow and incremental like that, it makes a decision to respond very difficult. That's the approach they take. And then your question about, outer islands or other things, that, would damage the economy. I mean, any number of things not necessarily directly related to combat conflict are all very much in the PRC's MO, their modus operandi.
Yeah. So, I mean, in the end, how would the U.S. respond to a situation like that? If they take the Prados Island, will the U.S. act or just let it take it? Because this is not the mainland of Taiwan.
Well, I think you saw I'm a big fan of ambiguity. And again, I'm just a citizen now. I don't carry any authority here, but I do think that showing your hand, exposing what you might do early on, some say that's a good way of deterring them, saying, hey, if you do that, we're going to respond overwhelmingly. I think there's probably merit to that. But how many of those xiamen, right? I mean, Jimen, any one of these small islands, the Penghus, you can think of endless what ifs here. And as I learned in diplomacy, never answer a hypothetical. So you don't want to get into this what if. You want to talk in bigger terms in terms of principle. And then another great conversation to have is deterrence. And what you're describing here is a bilateral U.S. versus China problem. And that was the case for quite a while. But when the Deputy Defense Minister of Japan, Aso Taro, came on, he says, nope, we too find this would be a important or critical national interest, because now the senkakus who are involved or other issues related to Taiwan that create access problems for Japan. Well, now it's not just the U.S. versus the PRC, it's U.S. and Japan and the PRC. You've also seen Europe, the UK, the French, increasingly the Germans, NATO more and more, Australia, others are also coming in saying, we hear the language coming out of Beijing. We notice there's saber rattling and threats of aggression. We are not going to put up with this. I think that's a great outcome. And I do think that is enough to make Beijing think twice, so long as that threat remains credible.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, what do they mean exactly? We're not going to put up with this. I mean, would they protect Taiwan without the U.S. if U.S. is being slow? Would they take the initiative like Japan and Australia?
I think Japan has demonstrated. Now, they still are under Article 9 of their own constitution that says that war is, they renounce the use of war as a policy, decision. And that's okay. But it's a self-defense force. And if they determine that any of these issues affect their own national defense, then you can see how that might trigger their ability to employ the self-defense force to defend itself. I'll let you talk to Japanese experts about what their calculus is. But the fact that the U.S. and Japan have a very strong alliance, in my mind, the strongest alliance in the region, 50,000 American folks posted there. And you can see some of the art here, 6 years, the Stilwell family being posted in Japan very productively and happily. I think the language coming out of both Washington and Tokyo is significant in deterring military adventurism. Now, here's where the conversation really needs to go. The Chinese government, the Beijing, wants us to narrow this conversation down to invasion scenarios on Taiwan, very specific, and I think in their mind, an area where they carry at least some advantage. That question, the calculus of advantage, might be possible if you're talking about only the PRC and the US. But when you add allies and partners, then there's no real conversation there. But they want us to speak on that, on invasion scenarios and all that stuff, where we have greater advantage is not in the East China Sea or the South China Sea, but in other allies and partners in the region. Again, India is its own being. They still very much in their non-aligned world. But what's going on the shared border there has empowered things like the Quad, India, Australia, Japan, and the US, and made that a very viable organization, orchestrate, what do you want to call it? So the Quad is useful. The Quad is another area where it's multilateralized. My point here is, now I'm focused on the military. Let's look at the economy. There are so many things that we could do that we're not doing to get the Chinese companies who operate basically without any audit requirements in our own economic system. And just to say that that's not useful anymore. Now we're moving in that direction, and we're moving at a deliberate pace. We could move a lot faster and just say those companies are no longer allowed to list. There's economic, there's political things we could do. And there's some really important information things we can do where, like the president, our messaging becomes more clear and combined with our allies and partners, again, as a strong message, not just to Beijing, but to the Chinese people as well, that this is not something you want to pursue. Leveraging nationalism is a terrible idea. We know that from history. We see them trying to do that here. We need to tell them that's the direction they don't want to go. Let me tell you a quick story on nationalism. In 1999, an American bomber incorrectly, without intent, but just made a mistake, ended up hitting the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, Yugoslavia.
Right.
You can understand that the PRC could interpret that in one of many ways. But one thing they did was they encouraged the Chinese people to attack American diplomatic functions in Beijing. And you remember the picture of the ambassador peering out through a broken window in the embassy compound in '99. What's interesting is as they did stir up nationalism and got the Chinese people all riled up about this thing, it didn't take very long, a day, maybe two, where those people, very angry, turned toward Tiananmen, which was just down the street, turned toward the Zhongnanhai, the leadership compound, and then begin to vent their anger toward the government and not necessarily toward the Americans any longer. This happens time and time again. So that's something we should consider is, if they do start using that nationalist tool, it has a history in China of backfiring.
Right, right. Talking about that, there's another example, the nationalism thing doesn't work in Taiwan. The popular opinion in Taiwan towards CCP has changed dramatically. The vast majority of the Taiwanese people would not accept one country, two system solution. So it seems like the peaceful unification with Taiwan is out of the question right now. In that case, how do you think Xi Jinping will solve this problem if he really wants to do it during his tenure?
Well, he's only himself to blame for the sentiment in Taiwan. The 2018 elections, as you remember, went very strong in the direction of the Kuomintang, who take an approach like the pro-establishment folks in Hong Kong, Regina Ip and the like. They take a position that it's better to work a deal with the PRC and come to some sort of accommodation. We all know that the Chinese will not uphold, the PRC won't uphold its side of that bargain, but that's their approach, is rather than risk something like war. I think the KMT side believes that working a deal might be the best outcome. And that made sense in a way in 2018. But in 2019, the PRC's really heavy-handed handling of Hong Kong and legitimate protests about the eroding autonomy made the elections in January 2020 a no-brainer. And so you saw Taiwan and DPP won a second term quite easily. So Beijing has no one to blame but itself for a very tactical victory in Hong Kong by shutting down the protests that were embarrassing Beijing. The narrative was that Hong Kong was going great and they loved China and being associated. The reality was we really don't want any more, communism here. We'd like to, be autonomous as we agreed to for 50 years. And so they handled that problem, again, short-term problem, but they created a much larger problem for themselves with Taiwan. Because now that, like you say, nobody in Taiwan with any sense believes that this one country, two systems agreement is ever going to work in their favor. They see their future looking a lot like Taiwan with the national security law, the basically dismissal of any Democrats, pandems in the LegCo, et cetera. So this is a lesson for Beijing: is actions have consequences. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, and in politics that works as well. That was not a smart move. They could have handled Hong Kong a lot better.
Yeah. So if that's the case, what options are left for Xi Jinping if he wants to solve this problem?
Well, I'll go back to that time statement. Time, and what's the penalty? What's the cost of waiting? If you believe that the status quo is basically stable, then time is your friend. You can wait until conditions get better to address this problem. Again, maybe something happens in Taiwan. Maybe the narrative on the PRC improves. There's no dealing with my PLA counterparts. A couple things really stood out. In my growing up, my world was very black and white. You either made a decision or you didn't make a decision. And if you didn't make a decision as a military leader, you were declared indecisive and of little use. In our system, we need decisive leaders who can react and advance, take the initiative, and all that stuff. Well, in their system, there's a third option. That third option is just choose not to decide. And you're not being criticized for not making a decision. In fact, everybody sees that as the safest outcome, is delaying a decision until the time is better to make a decision. Because if you're wrong, and if you make a bad decision, then you can be criticized and removed from power. I think this deters the things that most of us fear might happen with respect to Taiwan, is that in all those other aspects of messing with the economy and injecting itself into politics, political warfare, the book I just showed you, into stirring up problems and dissent inside democracies, messing with the media. These things are all relatively cost-free because we are not fighting on those battlegrounds. We're not responding in kind to their economic warfare to us. We should, and I think we're starting to do so. But they know that we could respond, and we probably would respond in kind in any sort of military aggression or an attack. So what's wrong with continuing to work in the economic, information, political, diplomatic sphere and letting that do its work and keeping that military option for the very, very end when you have no other choice? Our job is to keep them from concluding that they have no other choice. And again, delay that decision because that decision is as we used to say in flying fighters, it's a life-changing decision. Once you make that one, there's an outcome and there's no middle ground. You're going to win or you're going to lose. And I don't think Beijing wants to make that roll of the dice on that.
Okay. Am I understanding this right? You think the time is on Beijing's side?
Oh, I didn't say that. No, what I'm saying though is that it's not against them. It's neither for them or against them. And I mentioned status quo earlier. Some people would say that the situation with Taiwan has hit stasis, right? It's pretty much stable. Others would say that the longer that Taiwan remains removed and not independent and distant from Beijing, so long as it remains democratic and as long as it remains free market and not being run and just dictated to by Beijing, the longer that happens, the further the two drift apart. I'm not going to pitch in on one side or the other. But I do believe that Beijing sees the stasis, the fact that things are relatively stable, as to its advantage. And I think Taipei sees it to its advantage. Nothing wrong with that. Both sides feel like they're winning. There's no need to take unfortunate steps.
That's it for today. Please tune in for part 2 of this conversation tomorrow. Thanks for watching Zooming in China Chat. Please like, share, subscribe, and donate to this program if you like my content. As I've announced before, we're producing a documentary movie right now, Xi Jinping's War over Taiwan. It will come out by the end of this year. Zooming In members will get an early view of this movie. Our website is zoomingin.tv. Also, I would like to let you know that our website is experiencing some technical problems right now that resulted in payments not being processable. Therefore, your membership might be automatically canceled. We're fixing this problem right now, and once it's fixed, we'll send individual emails to every member so you can enroll again. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.